In the distant reaches of the galaxy, a planet once brimming with life and civilization now lay silent, and still the aliens who came to Earth no longer cared about its history. They came only for the forgotten treasures buried beneath the crumbled cities and cracked mountains. The stories of the humans had faded into myth. Their cities were nothing more than ruins to be picked clean by scavengers, whose only purpose was to find relics and resources lost to time. The air was thick with dust, and the ground trembled under the weight of ancient structures on the brink of collapse. The aliens had no idea what they were walking into. Earth was more than just a planet of human history. It was a world alive with secrets buried deep in its bones and its scars. The scavengers were confident that they would find something valuable, but what they didn't know was that Earth itself was waiting for them to awaken it after thousands of years of dormancy. The first signs of trouble came when they entered the ruins of a massive city. The structures were grand but broken, and the streets were eerily silent. Not a single sign of life could be seen. As the scavengers moved deeper into the city, their equipment began to malfunction. Their lights flickered and their communication devices buzzed with static. The air felt heavy, like something was watching them from the shadows, but they pressed on, dismissing it as the result of old tech. One of the aliens stumbled upon a doorway that had been buried under layers of dust and debris. With a sharp clang of metal, the door slid open, revealing a dark chamber inside. It was colder than the outside world, and the temperature seemed to drop as soon as they entered. The alien group cautiously advanced, scanning the room for anything useful. The walls were lined with strange markings that none of them could decipher, and at the far end of the room stood an old vault, its surface covered in rust and grime. One of the scavengers approached the vault with curiosity, his hand reaching for the dusty controls. As he activated the panel, a strange hum filled the room, and a soft light began to glow from within the vault. The air became charged, and the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate gently at first, but then with increasing force. As if something was awakening from a long slumber, they turned to each other, unsure of what was happening. Suddenly the voice came. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The words were simple and direct. Run. The voice carried a power that no one could ignore. It was filled with authority and urgency. The aliens froze, their hearts pounding in their chests, and their eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. They didn't know where the voice had come from or how it had spoken, but they knew that it wasn't just a message, it was a warning. The scavengers exchanged nervous glances. Some wanted to leave, others were too curious to walk away. They hesitated for a moment before continuing their search, unsure of what they had just experienced. But as they moved deeper into the vault, the storm outside began to stir. A faint rumble shook the ground, and the clouds above the city darkened ominously. Something was awakening, and the aliens were about to learn that Earth had been waiting for them all along. The scavengers stood frozen in place, their eyes darting around the vault, as if searching for the source of the voice that had just spoken. They could feel their breath quicken, and their hearts beat faster. The air was thick with an unnatural chill that made their skin crawl. It was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. The hum in the vault grew louder, and the temperature continued to drop. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. One of the aliens reached for his communicator to report back to the ship, but when he tried to speak, nothing came out. The device was silent, no signal, no response. He pressed it again, but still nothing. The silence was deafening. They couldn't explain what was happening. Their equipment was malfunctioning, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The air around them felt heavy, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Another alien started to speak, but was cut off by the voice again, louder this time, the words clearer. Run. It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a plea, it was a command. The voice carried an undeniable authority that made their bodies tense and their blood run cold. The command reverberated through the chamber, and the ground beneath them rumbled once more. It was as if the Earth itself was reacting to the warning. A wave of panic spread through the group. Some of the scavengers instinctively reached for their weapons, but none of them could shake the feeling that the threat they faced wasn't something they could fight with guns or technology. They were being warned by something far more ancient and powerful than they could understand. They backed away from the vault, slowly, their movements hesitant and unsure of what to do next. As they moved toward the exit, the storm outside seemed to intensify. The wind howled through the cracked windows, and the sky above darkened. Even further, the clouds churned and twisted, as if they were alive. The scavengers could hear the faintest sound of something massive moving in the distance, a deep growl that shook the very air around them. The ground trembled underfoot, and the walls of the ruins creaked and groaned, as though the city itself was about to collapse. The leader of the group was the first to speak, his voice shaky but firm. "We need to leave now." He turned to the others, urging them to follow him. But as they started to make their way out of the vault, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The door that they had entered through was now sealed shut. There was no way out except the way they had come in, and even that was blocked by debris that hadn't been there before. They turned back toward the vault. The hum had stopped, but the voice was still there, echoing in their minds. "Run." The word was like a drumbeat in their skulls, a reminder of the danger they were in, a warning. They could no longer ignore. The storm outside grew louder, and the scavengers could feel the planet itself shifting beneath them. The Earth was no longer just a dead world. It was awake, and it was angry. In their desperation to escape, they tried to force open the door, but it refused to budge no matter how hard they pushed or pulled. The vault was locked from the inside, as if it knew they were trying to leave. Something was holding them here, something far older than anything they had ever encountered, and they were starting to realize that they had made a terrible mistake by awakening whatever force had been waiting for them. The scavengers were trapped. They could feel the walls closing in on them. The vault door was sealed shut, and every attempt to break free only seemed to make the air heavier. The hum had stopped, but the tension was palpable. The strange voice that had warned them to run now echoed in their minds constantly, as if it was part of the very air itself. The ground beneath them continued to tremble slightly, as though Earth was alive and aware of their presence. Their tech was useless. They could not communicate with their ship or with each other. The only thing that remained was the eerie silence of the vault and the presence that filled it. One of the scavengers stood near the center of the room, staring at the walls, which were covered in strange markings. They tried to decipher the symbols, but they seemed to shift and change the more they looked at them. The markings felt alive, as if they were reacting to their gaze. The alien rubbed his eyes and turned to the others, his voice trembling as he spoke. "We are not alone here." His words hung in the air, and his companions turned to him with worried expressions. Another scavenger stepped forward. Her eyes narrowed as she inspected the vault more closely. Her hand reached out to touch one of the markings, and as soon as her fingers brushed the surface, the air seemed to pulse. A faint glow began to emanate from the walls, and suddenly the room was bathed in a soft blue light. The markings began to shift faster now, almost like they were alive, changing and rearranging themselves before their very eyes. It was as if the walls were trying to communicate, but the message was not clear. The scavengers backed away from the walls instinctively. Their weapons were drawn, but they could sense that guns and tools would do little to help them here. This was something else, something far beyond their understanding, a presence not of technology, but of something older, something far more primal. One of the aliens reached for a datapad in an attempt to analyze the situation, but the screen flickered and went blank. As soon as he tried to use it, the planet seemed to reject their technology altogether. Then the voice came again. It was stronger this time, more direct, and it reverberated through the entire room. "Run." The command was undeniable and filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. The scavengers' instincts kicked and panic set in, but there was nowhere to run. They were trapped in the vault, surrounded by walls that no longer felt like stone, but like living things. Another tremor shook the ground, this one far more violent than the previous ones. The vault seemed to groan, as though it were being disturbed from within. The aliens exchanged terrified glances. They were no longer dealing with mere ruins or ancient technology. They were dealing with something alive, something with purpose. And the message was clear. This world was not dead. It was watching them, and it wanted them gone. As they scrambled to find a way out, one of them noticed something in the center of the room, a pedestal with a glowing object resting on it. The object was small, but it radiated an undeniable power. The light from it flickered and pulsed like a heartbeat. It felt like it was calling to them, almost as if it had been waiting for them to find it. The scavengers hesitated. They knew better than to touch anything in this cursed place, but the voice still echoed in their minds, "Run." They looked at each other, torn between fear and curiosity, but before they could act, the ground shook again, this time with such force that the walls cracked and dust poured from the ceiling. The pedestal trembled, and the object began to glow brighter, its power resonating throughout the room with an intensity that made the scavengers stagger back. The earth itself seemed to be reacting to the object. The room was alive with energy, and the voice grew louder and louder until it was deafening. "Run." The command felt less like a warning and more like a decree, a force of nature that could not be ignored. The scavengers knew that whatever this object was, it held the key to Earth's power, and they had made a terrible mistake by awakening it. Far beneath the surface of the ruined Earth, in a forgotten chamber sealed off from time and space, a human awoke. The system designed to keep them in stasis had gently hummed to life, pulling them from their deep sleep. The world around them was foreign, dark, and cold. Their body felt stiff, like it had been centuries since they last moved, but their mind was sharp, their purpose clear. The last of their kind had risen from the tomb of humanity. The humans slowly opened their eyes, taking in the environment around them. The room was small and cramped, but unlike the rest of the planet, it was untouched by the ravages of time. The walls were lined with ancient technology, some of it human, others unknown, but they all seemed to pulse with an energy that felt almost alive. The humans sat up, their movements slow but deliberate, as they pushed themselves off the cold floor and onto their feet. The humans' mind raced as they took in the situation. They knew what had happened to Earth, the fall of humanity, the wars, the destruction of their home, and the last great effort to preserve their world and its secrets before the final battle was lost. They had been put into stasis to guard the planet's most important weapon, its last line of defense. The human didn't know how long they had been asleep, but they knew that something had stirred, something had come to Earth again, and the time had come for them to fulfill their mission. Standing in the center of the room, the human activated a series of controls. The air shimmered around them as holographic images of ancient cities and technology sprang to life. Their heart ached for the loss of their people, but they knew that this was not the time for grief. The galaxy had forgotten Earth. The universe had moved on, but they had been kept in reserve for this very moment, for when the predators would come, and the Earth needed a protector. The human turned to the vault across the chamber, where a series of forgotten relics rested on pedestals, each one an item of immense power, once belonging to the leaders of humanity's lost empire. These artifacts were not just weapons, they were tools of survival. The human had been trained to use them all, but now they only had one purpose: stop whatever threat had returned to Earth. As the human approached the vault, the voice that had whispered to the scavengers now reverberated through their mind, clearer than ever. "Run." The human's eyes narrowed. They had heard the whispers before. It had been a warning meant for the invaders, not them. They had been tasked with ensuring the Earth remained safe, but something had changed. The voice was no longer just a warning, it was a command from the Earth itself to flee. The invaders had awakened the planet's dormant defenses, and now they were in danger too. The human's hand tightened on the hilt of a weapon they had once wielded with ease. It had been designed to channel the Earth's energy, and when they activated it, a surge of power filled their veins. They could feel the connection to the planet deep within their bones. The Earth was no longer a dead world, it was a living force, and the human was its guardian. Without hesitation, the humans set off toward the heart of the ruined city, knowing that the aliens had already begun their search for the treasures they had disturbed. The time for hiding was over. The planet had sent its warning, and now the Earth's last defender would show the invaders the true power of humanity's legacy. The scavengers were no longer confident in their mission. The storm outside had escalated into a raging tempest that shook the very foundations of the ruins. It was as if the planet itself had come alive in response to their presence. The once silent Earth now roared in fury. The sky above them twisted and churned with unnatural clouds, and the winds howled like living creatures clawing at the Earth below. The aliens knew they had to leave, but they found themselves lost, trapped in a world that was no longer familiar. Their technology had failed them, and the very planet seemed intent on keeping them there. Their ships were grounded. The signals they sent out were met with nothing but static. The weapons they relied on malfunctioned when they tried to use them, and even their most basic tools seemed to stop functioning at the slightest touch. It was as if Earth itself was rejecting them, pushing them out. The scavengers had no choice but to retreat into the ruined city, searching for any escape they could find. But every path they tried was blocked by debris that hadn't been there before, or by strange creatures that emerged from the shadows. It wasn't just the planet that was out to get them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to move with a mind of its own, as though it had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The aliens heard the sound of something large and heavy moving beneath the earth. The rumbling grew louder and louder until the ground cracked open in front of them, and out of the fissures poured terrifying creatures from a bygone age, massive beasts with thick armored hides and eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that made their blood run cold. The scavengers fought back with everything they had, but their weapons barely scratched the beast's skin. Their firepower was useless against the ancient creatures that seemed to be made of stone and earth themselves. They could hear the voice again as the creatures closed in on them. Run. It was a command, not a warning. The voice had been the planet's last defense mechanism, and now it had awakened. The scavengers were no longer dealing with ruins. They were dealing with a living world that was determined to rid itself of them, no matter the cost. One by one, the scavengers fell back into the city, the creatures chasing them with relentless speed. But as they ran, they began to realize that the city was no longer the same. The buildings had shifted since their arrival. The paths they once knew had changed, the very streets twisted in unnatural ways, as though the city itself had transformed into a labyrinth designed to trap them. The alien sense of direction failed them. They had no idea where they were anymore, and the deeper they went, the more the world around them seemed to change. The walls were alive with movement, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. They were now fully aware that they were being hunted. They were not alone on this planet. No matter how much they ran, no matter how much they tried to escape, the creatures seemed to follow them, no matter where they went, and the city continued to shift around them, guiding them toward the one place they could not avoid, the vault where it had all begun. They reached the center of the city and found themselves standing before the massive vault once more, but this time the door was open. The pedestal inside was glowing brighter than ever before, and the voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar shaking the walls of the city itself. Run! It was the final command, and the scavengers knew they had no choice but to follow it. They had awakened the Earth's wrath, and now there was no escaping it. The scavengers were on the run, their every step a desperate attempt to escape the growing wrath of Earth itself. The ground continued to shake with increasing violence. The beasts that had emerged from the cracks in the earth stalked them relentlessly with each passing moment. They knew they were running out of time. Their weapons were useless, their communications dead, and the city they were in was no longer a structure but a living maze that seemed to shift and change around them. Their path had led them back to the heart of the city, toward the very vault they had once hoped to escape from. Now it was a place of terror. The door had opened, and the glowing pedestal at the center of the room pulsed with an energy that resonated in their bones. The earth had called them back, and there was no place left to hide. They had no choice but to confront whatever had been awakened. The scavengers entered the vault, their steps heavy with fear and uncertainty. The walls around them hummed with power, and the air grew thick with an energy they couldn't understand. The faint sound of the voice filled their minds. Once more, it wasn't the command to run anymore. It was something else, something darker. The earth was now speaking to them, as if it were a living entity. Its words were sharp and unforgiving. You should never have come here. The atmosphere in the vault grew colder, and the air began to swirl with dust, as though the room itself were alive. The scavengers felt the weight of the planet's anger pressing down on them. They could hear the sound of the creatures outside closing in their growls, and snarls growing louder with each passing second. But it wasn't the beasts that terrified them. It was the realization that they had no way to stop what was coming. No weapon could protect them from the wrath of an entire planet. In the center of the room, the glowing object on the pedestal seemed to pulse faster, its light growing brighter, and the temperature around it dropped dangerously low. The scavengers looked at it, their fear mounting, but none of them could look away. The power emanating from the object was overwhelming. Like nothing they had ever experienced before. It was as if the object itself held the key to Earth's fury, and they had unwittingly unleashed it. The voice spoke again, this time clearer than before. "You have disturbed the Earth's slumber, and now you will pay the price." The words were filled with an ancient bitterness and a deep sense of finality. The scavengers knew they were not going to survive this. They had awakened something far older and more powerful than they could ever comprehend, and now the planet itself had turned against them. But just as they were about to give in to despair, they heard something that made their blood run cold, the sound of footsteps approaching, not from the beasts outside, but from within the vault itself. Slowly walking toward them through the swirling dust came a figure, a human figure, the last human they had awakened. The scavengers froze, their eyes widening as the figure stepped into the light. The humans stood tall, their eyes cold and unwavering, their presence commanding and powerful. The weapon they carried crackled with energy, and the scavengers knew instantly that this was no ordinary person. They had awakened a force unlike anything they had ever encountered before. The humans spoke not a word, but their presence alone seemed to silence the room. The scavengers backed away instinctively. Their fear now fully realized the Earth's guardian had arrived, and they were no longer in control. The humans stood in the center of the vault, their presence commanding the very air around them. The scavengers could feel the weight of the planet's anger pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. The dust in the room swirled around the humans' feet, as though the Earth itself was bending to their will. The last of humanity had awakened, and with them came the power of the planet itself. The scavengers had no choice but to face the reality of their situation. They had awakened something ancient, something powerful, something they had no hope of understanding, much less controlling. The human before them was not just a survivor of the fallen Earth. They were its guardian, the protector of a planet that had been forgotten by the rest of the universe. And now they stood as the last line of defense between the invaders and the planet's wrath. The humans' eyes locked onto the scavengers, their gaze cold and unwavering. The silence in the room was deafening. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. The scavengers had disturbed something far beyond their comprehension, and now they would pay the price for their greed. The human reached for the weapon at their side, a staff crackling with energy that seemed to hum with the power of the Earth itself. The air around them vibrated with the force of it as they raised it slowly toward the glowing pedestal. The scavengers backed away instinctively. They had heard the legends of humanity's power, but they had dismissed them as myth stories of a time long gone. Now they realized just how wrong they had been. The human before them was not a myth. They were the living embodiment of Earth's fury, and they had no intention of allowing the scavengers to take anything else from this planet. With a single motion, the human struck the pedestal. The energy that erupted from the impact was overwhelming. It spread through the vault like a shockwave, rippling through the ground, and the air around them twisted and warped, as if reality itself was buckling under the force of the blow. The scavengers fell to their knees as the ground trembled beneath them. The walls of the vault cracked and groaned as the Earth reacted to the humans' power. Outside, the storm had intensified. The sky darkened further, and the wind howled like a wild beast. The creatures that had been hunting the scavengers stopped in their tracks, as if sensing the shift in the planet's energy. They retreated into the shadows as the Earth itself seemed to reclaim its territory. The city that had once been a trap for the invaders was now alive. With purpose, the streets shifted and reformed. The ruins seemed to heal before their eyes as the land around them began to reclaim what had been taken. The scavengers could feel it, the power of the Earth surging through the ground beneath them. It was as if the planet was no longer content to simply defend itself. It had decided to fight back with everything it had. The human was no longer just a protector. They were the Earth's chosen champion, its final weapon in the battle for survival. One of the scavengers tried to speak, but their voice was drowned out by the force of the Earth's power. Run. The voice boomed through the vault. It wasn't just a warning. It was a command. The same voice that had called to them earlier now demanded that they leave. But it was too late. The scavengers had already awakened something they could not undo, and the planet would make sure they paid the price for it. The human raised their weapon again, and the Earth trembled once more. This time, with the force of a final warning, the scavengers knew they had no choice but to run. But as they turned to flee, the door to the vault slammed shut with an echoing crash, trapping them inside. The last defender of Earth had made sure there would be no escape for them. The scavengers were trapped. There was no way out. The walls of the vault were sealed tight, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an unrelenting energy. The humans stood motionless in the center of the room, their weapon glowing with power. The very air around them crackled with the Earth's fury. It was no longer a question of whether the invaders could escape. It was a question of whether they could survive what was coming. The scavengers tried to move, but their bodies were frozen with fear. The power in the vault was overwhelming, and the presence of the human was undeniable. It was as if they were no longer just dealing with a person, but with the living embodiment of Earth's wrath. The very force that had been dormant for eons had now awakened to protect its world, and it would not let the invaders take anything more from it. The humans' eyes locked onto the scavengers. As they slowly raised their weapon, the staff crackled with energy, as if responding to the humans' will. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. The scavengers could feel the planet's rage building around them. It wasn't just the storms outside, or the creatures lurking in the shadows. It was something far deeper. It was the Earth itself standing against them. The human raised the staff and slammed it into the ground with a force that sent a shockwave through the vault. The scavengers were knocked off their feet as the very walls seemed to crack and shake with the impact. It was as though the Earth was rejecting them, pushing them out with every ounce of its power. The vault began to shake apart. The ceiling cracked and dust poured from the walls as the planet itself tried to rid itself of the invaders. The scavengers struggled to their feet as the vault collapsed around them. The human was unyielding, their eyes burning with the fury of the Earth. As they stood firm in the center of the chaos, the voice that had once warned them now echoed through the vault louder than ever. Run. It wasn't a plea, it was a command, and the scavengers realized that it was no longer the Earth that had spoken to them. It was the human. The last of humanity had become the embodiment of the planet's defense. With one final surge of energy, the humans swung their weapon again, and the walls of the vault shattered. The ceiling caved in, and the entire structure began to collapse. The scavengers scrambled to their feet in panic as the ground beneath them crumbled, but there was no escape. The human stood at the center of it, all a figure of pure power and fury. The Earth had chosen its protector, and there was no place for the invaders in its world. The scavengers tried to flee, but the Earth had made sure there would be no escape for them. The planet itself seemed to twist and shift. The ruins surrounding them came alive and blocked their path. Every way they turned, they were faced with walls of earth that rose up from the ground itself. The creatures that had once hunted them now joined in the attack, as if guided by the same will. The human had unleashed. The scavengers were no longer the hunters, they were the prey, and the Earth was closing in around them. As the last of the scavengers were swallowed by the Earth, the human stood tall in the center of the ruins, watching as the planet reclaimed what had once been taken from it. The storm outside had finally subsided, and the sky began to clear. The Earth was no longer a dead world, it was alive again, and it would never allow another invader to set foot on its soil. The human turned and walked away. Their mission complete, the Earth had been protected, and humanity's legacy would endure forever.